Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's installment of the Spring Seminar Series hosted by the SNF Centre for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University and sponsored by the Classical Association of Canada Western Lecturer Tour. Each year we invite leading international scholars working in different aspects of Hellenic studies to present their research on a wide range of topics in the fields of archaeology, classics, Byzantine, Ottoman, and modern Greek history, as well as literary and cultural studies. But before we begin, let me take this opportunity to acknowledge that the event was organized at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. We're grateful. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom privacy and security guidelines, I would ask you to visit the SFU IT Services website. At the conclusion of the presentation, we'll host a Q&A session. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation, and we'll try our best to address all of them afterwards. If you would like to ask a question personally, please use the raise hand button and our event coordinator will unmute you. I am pleased to present Dr. Kyle Gervais, an Associate Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Western Ontario. His teaching and research focuses on classical Latin poetry and its reception from late antiquity to the modern day. His books and articles include work on Virgil, Horace, Seneca, Statius, Claudian, John of Garland, medieval pseudo-Ovidian poetry, Maffeo Veggio, and Quentin Tarantino. The title of his paper today is Reading Virgil, Caieta's Cult, Aeneas' ἀχος, and some gaps in the Aeneid from antiquity to the Beaver Wars. Dr. Gervais.
Thank you very much, David, for that kind introduction. I assume everyone can hear me. Yep. I have carefully curated my Zoom background, but just realized that I'm wearing a Queen's University sweater, which is not quite on brand for Western. That was my undergraduate institution, and I still have some loyalties there. But let's all pretend that that isn't there. It is a real pleasure to be able to speak to all of you today, even if it's by means of our old friend Zoom. I'm sad that I won't be able to visit you in person, but I'm grateful to the CAC and to the participating department for being flexible enough to switch this lecture tour to a remote delivery. So I will share my screen. There we are. And we'll get it maximized. There we go. The talk should run for almost exactly 50 minutes. The PDF that has been shared in the chat just reproduces the slides that are here in case anyone wants to refer backwards. I know that I'm speaking to a generalist audience with some undergraduates, and so I've kept that in mind throughout. It can sometimes be a little difficult to discuss the Aeneid without getting lost in Virgil's wonderfully tricky Latin. I have given English translations of everything, and please feel free to ask me about anything at all that didn't make sense at the end of the talk, and I'll try to explain myself more clearly. In fact, the first part of the talk is probably the most complicated, so if I lose you here as I get all excited about the nitty-gritty details of Virgil's Latin, just hang on, and I think it will get easier in the last 2/3 of the talk. I have assumed some familiarity with the plot of the Aeneid, so if it's a completely new poem to you, consider this my argument for why it's worth you reading it. So here we go. In the last 2/3 of the talk, we will address a couple of later poems, or rather in the last part of the talk, we'll address a couple of later poems that make reference to the Aeneid, but we'll start with the Aeneid itself and with two characters in the Aeneid that don't typically get talked about. First, Virgil, Aeneas's nurse Caieta, who dies as Aeneas reaches Italy and gets a funeral at the start of Aeneid Book 7. And of course, by nurse, I mean wet nurse or governess or nanny. Second, we'll talk about Aeneas's faithful companion Achates, who seems to be with him pretty much all the time in the poem and has challenged readers ever since antiquity to explain what exactly he means. I'm also going to be organizing my talk in terms of various ways that I approach Virgil's Aeneid, namely textual criticism, intertextuality, and reception studies, three large areas of scholarly activity in Latin literary studies. So we start with Caieta and textual criticism. Textual criticism, in case you haven't run into the term before, is when you pay attention to the actual Latin text of the poem, keeping in mind that all of ancient literature survives to us thanks to manuscripts. And here are images from a couple of manuscripts of Virgil's poem from the 6th century and the 9th or the 10th centuries. Manuscripts are handwritten copies, which were written at first in antiquity onto papyrus scrolls, and then in later antiquity into books made of parchment. And parchment is made of sheep, goat, or calf skin, so we have a lot of barnyard animals to thank for the survival of ancient literature. And my screen has just frozen on my script, so give me 1 second. Technical difficulties are inevitable. There we are. Okay. Right, so we're talking about manuscripts, and of course, when you're copying things by hand, errors gradually start to accumulate. And so our surviving copies of all ancient literature, including the Aeneid, have differences large and small in the text of each individual manuscript. So one job of the textual critic is to compare all of these manuscripts and try to come up with a text as close as possible to what the ancient author wrote. And this is why scholarly editions of ancient texts have what's called an apparatus criticus at the bottom of the page, summarizing the information to be found in the manuscripts. This is the first page of Virgil's Aeneid in the edition by Conti in the Teubner series that we'll come back to in a little bit. Another very important job of the textual critic is to decide when none of the manuscripts have preserved what the ancient author wrote in a given spot, and then try to imagine what the author most likely did write, which was then corrupted in all of the later handwritten copies. And this process is called emendation, or textual or conjectural emendation. And scholars have been doing this to the Aeneid for 2 millennia, starting very soon after Virgil died. But we haven't fixed everything, which is good, because otherwise textual critics like me would be out of a job. So here's one spot where I've suggested an emendation and managed to convince some people that I've reconstructed successfully what Virgil actually wrote. As I said, at the beginning of Aeneid Book 7, Aeneas buries his nurse Caieta, and this is what Virgil writes. You too, Aeneas' nurse, in dying have given eternal fame to our shores, Caieta, and now your honor keeps its home and your name marks your bones in great Italy, if that is any glory. But pious Aeneas, the funeral duly performed, and a burial mound heaped up as soon as the high seas grew calm, set sail and leaves port. The words I'm focusing on are, but pious Aeneas, the funeral duly performed. In Latin, at pius exsequies Aeneas rite solutis. Pius Aeneas means pious Aeneas, exsequies means the funeral, and rite solutis means duly performed. Now, this is the Latin text that has survived in all of the manuscripts we have, but I don't think it's the text that Virgil actually wrote. I want to pick on the words exsequies Aeneas. there are three suspicious things about this phrase. First, in two of the most important manuscripts that survived to us from late antiquity, the scribes who copied the text actually wrote the words in the reverse order and then later corrected them. And you can see that in one of those manuscripts from the 6th century. It's hard to read the actual handwritten Latin, but here we have A-E-N, E-A-S, E exsequies, and then you have these two little marks here, which are an editorial symbol that means reverse the order of the words. Now, when textual critics see mistakes like this, we tend to pay attention because they could indicate that there is a more significant problem that didn't get fully corrected by just reversing the words like this. A second and even more suspicious thing involves the use of Virgil's phrase, pius Aeneas, pious Aeneas. He uses this phrase a lot in the Aeneid, 18 other times in addition to our passage. But everywhere else he uses it, he puts the words pious Aeneas side by side. Everywhere else except for here, where the words are separated by exsequies, that word meaning funeral. So that's a little bit strange. But here's the most strange thing. And to understand it, I'm going to introduce you to the type of poetry that the Aeneid is, written in something called dactylic hexameter. Dactylic hexameter is made up of 6 feet, basically 6 units that all take the same amount of time to pronounce, and you give a little bit of extra emphasis to the beginning of each unit. So our line sounds like this, and I'll exaggerate for effect. At pius exsequies Aeneas rite solutis. 1 and a 2 and a 3 and 4 and 5 and a 6 and. Now, Virgil writes the word Aeneas a lot, which is not surprising in a poem called the Aeneid. He writes it 238 times. 54 of those times, he puts the word Aeneas at the very beginning of the first foot in a line like Aeneas qui tanta Deo permissa potestas. 145 times he puts the word Aeneas at the very beginning of the second foot in a line like quos pater Aeneas si quando adversa vocarent. 38 times Virgil puts Aeneas at the very beginning of the third foot, like ac tutum pius Aeneas ad quinticer aevi. And then there is our line. Here, the word Aeneas starts in the middle of the third foot. This is the only time out of 238 instances where Aeneas starts in the middle of the foot. And it's more or less the only time in all of surviving Latin poetry where the word Aeneas starts in the middle of any foot. So that's weird, right? And it is, I think, enough for us to be convinced that there is something wrong here. Virgil just wouldn't write something that goes against his normal style in several important ways. So often the hardest part of making an emendation is recognizing that there is something wrong with the text. And that's one reason why I took a while explaining what was wrong. Fixing the problem, once you've recognized it, is not exactly easy, and it's usually the place where the textual critic gets to show everyone how clever he or she or they are. And I don't want you to think that I'm too much of a show-off, so I'll explain how to fix the problem quickly. So hold on. First, we start with those two important late antique manuscripts, where the scribe initially copied the words exsequies Aeneas in the reverse order Aeneas exsequies. And then we assume that this isn't just a trivial error, that this represents something actually important. Because with this reversed order, you have the phrase pius Aeneas, pius Aeneas, with the words side by side like they're supposed to be. And you have the word Aeneas at the beginning of the second foot, which is the most common place for Virgil to put it. But then your problem is that this word exsequies has a rhythm that doesn't fit at this particular spot in a dactylic hexameter. And I can talk more about that in the question period if you're curious. So what we need is a word that basically means the same thing as exsequies, funeral, because there's nothing wrong with the sense of the line, but we need a word that fits at this particular spot in the line. And long story short, the word we want is sacris. This is a more general word for sacred ritual. And then our only other problem is that sacris isn't quite long enough to fill the blank space in the line when you remove the word exsequies. So you just kind of casually throw in a little extra word, iam, which means now. And that is what I think Virgil wrote. At pius exsequies, at pius Aeneas, sacris iam rite solutis. But pius Aeneas, the rituals now duly performed. And how do we know that this is what Virgil wrote? Well, we don't know for sure, but there are various lines of evidence that we can introduce from Virgil's own poem, from the models in Hellenistic literature that he was adapting, and most importantly, from the version of Caieta's funeral found in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which has this line here, Trojan Aeneas, when the sacred rituals had been performed according to custom, which looks very much like it is alluding to Virgil's line in the corrected form, especially Aeneas sacris, Aeneas sacris. And so that strongly suggests that Ovid's text of the Aeneid, shortly after Virgil died, had sacris in it, not exsequies. In any case, as I said, I have managed to convince some people that Virgil did indeed write this corrected form. This is my corrected text in the most recent edition of the Aeneid, the Teubner edition by Conti. When you have some success with an emendation like this, you're obligated to brag a little bit. So thank you for your patience as I do that. But if Virgil wrote Aeneas sacris iam, why on earth do the manuscripts say exsequies Aeneas? This is why, I think. Someone was reading the poem back in antiquity and saw that Virgil used the general word sacris, meaning rituals. Our reader wanted to explain that the specific ritual Virgil had in mind was a funeral. And so the reader wrote the word exsequies, funeral, above the word sacris to explain it. Then someone came along and copied this text with exsequies written above sacris and accidentally copied the word exsequies instead of sacris into his text. This kind of copying error happened so often that we've given it a fancy name. It's an intrusive gloss. This error leaves us with the text Aeneas exsequies, which is exactly what we read in two of the most important ancient manuscripts. But the rhythm of that phrase is wrong, as I said, and so a scribe tried to fix it in the wrong way by flipping the words around to give us exsequies Aeneas. And again, that's exactly the correction that we see in those two important manuscripts. So that's the kind of thing that textual critics do, and I promise that was the nerdiest part of my talk. But before moving on to the second part, I would like to spend a minute or two thinking about the broader implications of this correction. Because, right, who cares really if Virgil wrote exsequies, meaning funeral, or sacris, meaning rituals? Not much of a difference. Well, here's one difference. Exsequies are what you do for any Roman who has died, including humble people like a nurse, like Caieta. But sacris, rituals in the Aeneid, are specifically the rituals you give to heroes who have died and who you are subsequently going to worship as a god, or rather as a local cult hero. So we can more precisely translate sacra as cult rituals. The first half of the Aeneid has several examples of people dying and getting cult rituals. There is the important Trojan Palinurus, who dies and gets a cult at a place in Italy now called Cape Palinuro. There is the important Trojan Maecenas, who dies and gets elaborate cult rituals at a place now called Misenum. Most importantly, there is Aeneas' father Anchises, who dies and gets very, very elaborate cult rituals and funeral games, which were understood to be the origin of the Roman Parentalia festival. And then there's Caieta, a woman and a humble nurse. There is already the implication that she gets a cult because the place she dies is thereafter called Caieta. But if Virgil wrote that Aeneas gave her sacris, cult rituals, then Virgil makes this cult very explicit and invites us to compare it with the cult rituals of the elite Trojan males whose royal names dot the landscape of Roman Italy. Now, what exactly does that mean for Virgil's poem? Well, I hope that that's something someone will explore further someday. But for now, it's at least a reminder that there is room in Virgil's poem, not just for famous male warriors, or even for elite women like Queen Dido, but also for the woman who nursed and rocked and played peekaboo with the little baby Aeneas before he got all grown up and went off to found Rome. We'll move on now to the second section of the talk, and I'm going to take a break for 30 seconds just to have a drink of water. I'll be back in 1 second. Okay, now it's time to talk about another understudied character in the Aeneid, Achates, or as Virgil often calls him, Fidus Achates, faithful Achates. He is Aeneas' ever-present friend, confidant, and assistant. He makes campfires for the Trojans, holds Aeneas' bow and arrows, drives his chariot, listens to him when he's sad, runs his errands, and pretty much keeps silent throughout the whole poem. He must mean something, both because he is closely connected with Aeneas, and more generally because pretty much everything in Virgil's obsessively clever poem means something. But what? Well, we get part of the answer by looking at the etymology of Achates' name. Modern scholars have paid more and more attention to how Virgil uses etymology to make meaning in his poem, and more generally, the etymology of words and names is something that was very important to the Greeks, Romans, and their successors in the Middle Ages right up through the early modern period. The value that all these people placed on etymology is summed up by the Latin phrase, nomen est omen. The name is an omen or a sign of an object or person's true nature. And it's important to note that it doesn't really matter whether the etymology is strictly correct. In fact, most ancient etymologies don't tell us where the word actually came from. The important thing is that the maker or reader of the etymology believed that it held the key to the true nature of whatever was being named. In fact, probably my favorite etymology is incorrect. It is an etymology we find in the Middle Ages for the Latin word femina, meaning woman. This word was connected to the Greek word phos, which means light, but later was understood also to mean fire. And the explanation is that women are more lustful than men, which is the opposite of our modern stereotype, right? And so women etymologically have more fire in them than men. Now, etymologically, this is completely wrong. Femina is actually derived from a Proto-Indo-European word meaning to suck, because women are the ones who nurse babies. But the false etymology tells us something interesting about the beliefs of the culture that created it. So what's our etymology for Achates that tells us something about him or about Virgil's poem, even if the etymology isn't, strictly speaking, correct? Servius, the famous commentator on Virgil from the 4th century, tells us that Achates comes from the Greek word ἄχος, which means grief or pain. And Servius explains that Achates, as Aeneas' constant companion, represents the cares that are the constant companion of a ruler. And it turns out that Servius is basically right. Virgil probably does want us to connect Achates with the Greek word ἄχος. First of all, the only ancient etymology that we have for Aeneas connects his name with ἄχος. Aeneas' father is Anchises, and his mother is the goddess Venus, or Aphrodite in Greek. And a Greek poem called the Homeric Hymn to Aphrodite tells the story of this goddess coming to Anchises in the wilderness to have sex with him. And at the end of the poem, Aphrodite gives a prophecy that she will give birth to a great hero, and he will be named Aeneas because of the terrible pain, as in the mental anguish, that seized her when she fell into the bed of a mortal man. Terrible pain in Greek is ainon ἄχος. So there is our ἄχος, but the real connection with Aeneas' name is, of course, the adjective ainon. The second part of the phrase, ἄχος, doesn't correspond with anything in Aeneas' name. So Virgil improves on this Homeric etymology by giving Aeneas a companion named Achates, ainon and Áχος together. And one of the very first times that he shows the two of them together is in a scene modeled on the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. In Virgil's poem, it isn't Aeneas' father Anchises who has an encounter with Aphrodite in the wilderness, but rather Aeneas himself, accompanied by Achates, seeing his mother in disguise in the wilderness near Carthage. But Virgil gets even more meaning out of this Áχος etymology, because another great hero from the Trojan War had a name that was etymologically connected to Áχos, and that's Achilles. At least one ancient author and several later etymological dictionaries explain that he was named Achilles because he caused pain, ἄχος, to the Ilians, which is another name for the Trojans. So Aeneas is connected to Achilles by the idea of pain, ἄχος, and Virgil emphasizes that connection by giving Aeneas a companion named Achates. And Virgil spells out that connection even more clearly a little after Aeneas and Achates meet Venus near Carthage. After that moment, the pair travel to Carthage itself and look at some scenes from the Trojan War on a temple of Juno. And Aeneas saw the battles of Ilium depicted in order and the war which fame had now spread through the entire world. The sons of Atreus and Priam, and Achilles terrible to both. Aeneas stopped and said through his tears, "What place, Achates? What region of the world is not now full of our toil?" So when Aeneas, a man of pain, sees Achilles, another man of pain, for the first time in the epic, he does so while standing beside Achates, whose name means pain. And just so we don't overlook those connections, Virgil makes sure to put the Latin word Achilles directly above Achates at the end of two lines in the Latin. So all of this is pretty clever, I think, but it wasn't discovered by me. I've been summarizing a brilliant article by an Italian scholar named Sergio Casali. But I've recently decided to pick up where Casali left off at the point where he had established that Aeneas and Achates mean terrible pain, ainon Áχος, and that this connects Aeneas with Achilles as two men of pain. But then what does Virgil do with all of this after he establishes those connections? Here we have to move to the second half of the Aeneid, which is traditionally called its Iliadic half, because it basically reproduces the plot of the Iliad. In the Iliad, Achilles and Hector are on opposite sides of a war over Helen. Hector kills Achilles' close friend Patroclus. This drives Achilles nearly insane with grief and anger, or more specifically with the emotion Áχος. Achilles slaughters a whole bunch of people before finally killing Hector. Similarly, in the Aeneid, Aeneas and Turnus are on opposite sides of the war over Lavinia. Turnus kills Aeneas' close friend Pallas. This drives Aeneas nearly insane with grief and anger, and I think we're meant to understand those emotions as Áχος. Aeneas slaughters a whole bunch of people before finally killing Turnus. So then, the specific ἄχος that links Aeneas and Achilles together as men of pain is the ἄχος that they feel after the death of their close friends Pallas and Patroclus. And again, Achates helps to signal this link. Here we're in the middle of Aeneid, Book 8. Aeneas and Achates have traveled to the place in Italy that would eventually become the city of Rome and have met with the local ruler, King Evander. Evander is the father of Pallas. Aeneas and Evander discuss an alliance. Aeneas is accompanied by Achates. Evander is accompanied by his son Pallas. Evander agrees to an alliance, and as a pledge of his new faith in Aeneas, he sends him away with his son Pallas to go fight Turnus. This is the moment when Pallas steps into the role of the hero's sidekick like Patroclus, and when we start to understand how Aeneas is going to play the role of the hero like Achilles. And at this exact moment, when Evander entrusts his son Pallas to Aeneas, we get a passage that names Aeneas, Achates, Anchises, and Venus, which are all the names you need to make the reader think back to that Homeric hymn of Aphrodite and its etymology of Aeneas from ἄχος. This is what Virgil says: as Evander finished speaking, Anchises' son Aeneas and faithful Achates held their gazes fixed, thinking many hard things in their sad hearts. But then Cytherean Venus gave a sign in the clear sky. So Virgil is basically saying, look, I'm going to retell the story of Achilles and Patroclus with Aeneas and Pallas. And Aeneas is going to feel ἄχος in exactly the same way as Achilles did. And this all makes sense because Aeneas is named for terrible pain. But there's a little bit more in these lines. The line of Latin that has Aeneas and Achates together is Aeneas Anchisiades et fidus Achates. This is very close to two lines of Greek from the Iliad that also start with Aeneas being called Anchisiades, Anchises' son. And these are the only two times in the Iliad when Aeneas is called Anchisiades. The first is when Aeneas and Hector are fighting side by side to try to capture the body of Patroclus after Hector killed him, Anchises' son Aeneas and glorious Hector. The second line is a bit later when Achilles is in the grip of ἄχος for Patroclus and is attacking any Trojan he can find, including Aeneas himself. Homer gives us a showdown between Aeneas Tanchisiades kai Deus Achilles, Anchises' son Aeneas, and godlike Achilles. So at this very complicated moment in the Aeneid, when Virgil sets up the correspondences between the story of Achilles' Áχος and the upcoming story of Aeneas' Áχos, we get a reference not only to the etymology of Aeneas from Áχos in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, but also to specific moments in the middle of that story in the Iliad where Achilles is feeling Áχos over Patroclus. Both of Homer's lines start Anchises' son Aeneas. One ends with glorious Hector, Phaidimos Hector. The other with Deus Achilles, godlike Achilles. Virgil's line ends with faithful Achates, Fidus Achates. And that adjective, which is used repeatedly for Achates throughout the epic, means something very specific and important. Aeneas and Achilles are linked by the Áχos that they feel for Pallas and Patroclus, but there's an important difference in the cause of that Áχos. Achilles feels pain because Patroclus was dear to him. In Greek, he was his philos. Pallas is also dear to Aeneas, but there's another thing joining them together. Aeneas had made an alliance with Pallas's father Evander, an alliance which is called in Latin a foedus. When you make a foedus with someone, you put your faith in them, you give them your fides, and you hope that they won't abuse that fides, you hope that they will be faithful, fidus. When Aeneas is unable to stop Turnus from killing Pallas, he basically lets down Pallas's father Evander. The fides that Evander gave to Aeneas when he gave him his son Pallas has been broken. And this causes Evander pain. But it also causes Aeneas pain because he's failed at upholding one of the most important Roman virtues, fides. And that is why Achates is frequently described as fidus. He doesn't just symbolize the link between Achilles and Aeneas in the ἄχος that they feel over the deaths of Patroclus and Pallas. He also shows us that Aeneas's pain is particularly Roman. It's the pain that you feel when you let down your friends or your allies, when you aren't able to keep your fides. So I'm going to move on now to the last section of the talk, but I am leaving out a lot of interesting tidbits about Achates. In particular, I think that Achates is there at the very end of the Aeneid when Aeneas kills Turnus, even though Virgil doesn't name Achates here. And I think his shadowy presence at that point, at the end, points out another way that Aeneas and Achilles' ἄχος is different. And I'd be happy to talk about that in the question period. So we'll move on to the final section, and I will take just another 30-second break. I'll be back in a second. Okay, here we're going to talk about two different moments in the Aeneid's reception, meaning two authors that have received what Virgil did in the Aeneid and made reference to it to help them achieve their own literary goals. One of the recurring themes in the reception of the Aeneid is the idea of filling in gaps that Virgil left in his story, whether it's scenes that Virgil passes over quickly, or parts of the myth of Aeneas that Virgil doesn't narrate, or ideas that aren't fully explored, or in my first example, lines of Virgil's poetry that he literally left unfinished. Let's start with filling in a literal gap. There are 58 so-called half lines in the Aeneid, lines that stop somewhere before you get the full 6 feet of that dactylic hexameter I was talking about. These half lines are presumably connected to the fact that Virgil died before he was able to make his final edits to the Aeneid. Some of the half lines are quite satisfying exactly as they are, and it could be that Virgil was planning all along to have a few striking short lines throughout his poem, or it could be that he hadn't quite figured out how to fill in the line at the time of his death. But in any case, poets writing after Virgil, of course, started to think of these half lines as one of those Virgilian gaps that they could fill in. And they found a bunch of clever ways to make reference to a half line and then complete it. And in a handful of places, they even found a clever way to basically say, get it? Virgil's line was unfinished, and I've finished it here. This is my favorite example of that. It's going to come from one of Ovid's poems called the Fasti. Ovid is telling the origin story of the Roman goddess Anna Perenna, and explains that she was originally Queen Dido's sister, Anna. Ovid tells us that after Dido's death, Carthage was invaded, and Anna was forced to flee into exile. She sailed around the Mediterranean, basically recreating the story of Aeneas, fleeing Troy and sailing around the Mediterranean before reaching Italy. One part of Aeneas's journey, which is how the plot of the Aeneid starts, and this is here, one part is being on course for Italy when a storm blows his fleet off course and wrecks it on the shores of Libya. This is Virgil's text. There is a place which the Greeks call Hesperia, an ancient land, powerful in war and with rich soil. Enotrians lived there, but now the rumor is that later people called it Italy in honor of their leader. This was our course. There's the half line, hic cursus fuit. You can see how it's shorter than all of the other lines, of course. This was our course when a sudden storm came up and eventually blew us to the shores of Libya. In Ovid's Fasti, Anna experiences a similar storm that blows her off course, and this is described in very similar language. There is a little countryside near the fish-filled stream of stony Crathis River. The natives call it Cameri. This is a place in Italy. Now here comes Ovid's reference to Virgil's half-line. Illuc cursus erat. Anna's course was towards that place. And then Ovid completes the line. And Anna was no farther away than 9 slingshot lengths of the place when a sudden storm came up and blew her off course to a different part of Italy. So yes, Ovid is basically saying, look, I can take Virgil's story of Aeneas wandering the Mediterranean and repurpose it for my story of Anna wandering the Mediterranean. And I can take a line that Virgil didn't finish and show you one way of finishing it. But my favorite part is this. The words that Ovid uses to complete Virgil's half-line are nec longius abfuit inde, and she was no farther away from that place. If you read just the first 2 words immediately after this allusion to the half-line, you have nec longius, and no farther. And I think this is Ovid saying Virgil's line goes hic cursus fuit and no farther. Okay, I'm going to spend the last 12 or 13 minutes talking about a poem that identifies a different kind of gap in the Aeneid, not some missing words in a half-line, but rather a spiritual gap. This is a poem by a Jesuit missionary, a frighteningly devout Christian, who's talking about the martyring of some of his fellow missionaries just a couple hours down the road from me in what is a town called Midlands, Ontario now. And in the poem, he thinks about the glorious afterlife of the martyrs in the Christian heaven. And this is, of course, a gap that the pagan Virgil couldn't even imagine in his poem. So here we see the 10-line Latin poem as it was written in New France sometime after 1650, included at the start of Le Journal des Jésuites, which is a work that records the failed Jesuit mission to convert the Hurons. And this is the poem at the start of that manuscript. The poem centers on the destruction in 1649 of the Jesuit settlement of Sainte Marie among the Hurons during the so-called Beaver Wars of the Iroquois Confederacy against the French and their indigenous allies, the Algonquins and the Hurons. At the same time as Sainte Marie among the Hurons was destroyed, the Huron people themselves were nearly massacred, and the survivors were driven off their land by the Iroquois. And I'm using the terms Iroquois, Algonquins, and Hurons as in the Latin poem, and as they're still sometimes used today, but it's important to note that the terminology has evolved, and this isn't just an academic exercise. I noted that the site of Sainte Marie among the Hurons, right here, is just a couple hours away from me, right down here, in a town that has a shrine to the, in a town called Midlands, Ontario, and that town has a shrine to the 8 Jesuits who were martyred when their settlement was destroyed. So this is a history that's still alive to many Catholics. I think of my grandpa, who was a devout Catholic and made sure we went to church every Christmas, which is the most we would agree to. But the indigenous people that the poem called the Iroquois call themselves the Haudenosaunee. And when I acknowledge the land on which I live and work, and from which I'm speaking to you today, I acknowledge the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoak, and Arawandran peoples, whose traditional lands I am sitting on today. And the history is, of course, still alive for these peoples as well, in a particularly painful way. The Hurons, among whom the Jesuits made their settlement at Sainte Marie, had a population of between 20 and 40,000 before European contact, but after that contact were nearly decimated and displaced from their land by a combination of disease and war. So this is unusually sensitive material for a Latin literary scholar like me to be playing around with. And I always want to keep in mind that the perspective I'm getting in this very short poem is the Jesuit perspective. So with that in mind, here we go with the poem. It's just 10 lines long, and it's written as I said, of course, in Latin, but I'll give you just the English for ease. If there was time for you to hear the chronicles of our labors, evening in heaven would close up and put an end to the years, before I could relate all the details, starting from the very beginning. As in, the story of our suffering is the long one. Is there any place on earth so full of labors like ours? Look upon the sequence of the sacred battles of our people, the wars that fame hath now spread through the whole world, mangled limbs and bodies burned in fire. This is a reference to the martyring of the 8 Jesuit missionaries. The Iroquois plotted to obliterate the famous race of the Hurons and laid waste to the colonists with a great slaughter. They killed their enemies and destroyed the Algonquins. This is the destruction of Sainte Marie among the Hurons and the slaughtering and displacement of the indigenous people in that territory. The whole poem is very closely modeled on passages of the Aeneid. The first 3 lines, as you can see by my elaborate color coding, repeats almost word for word Aeneas' speech to his mother Venus in Aeneid Book 1, when he says that the story of the Trojans' suffering is too long to tell. The next 3 lines on the fact that the Jesuit suffering is well known repeats almost word for word Aeneas' reaction to seeing the story of the Trojan War depicted on the Temple of Juno at Carthage. And you can see the correspondences in the English. They're even clearer in the Latin, in fact. So with these references, the poet is making a connection between the Trojans and the Jesuits. Both left home in Troy or France to come to a new land, and both were made famous by their trials and tribulations. In the 8th line, the Iroquois plotted to obliterate the famous race of the Hurons. The poet makes reference to Virgil's description of the Etruscans, who were allies of the Trojans in Italy, as a race made famous in war, famous race, gens praeclara in the Latin. So if the Jesuits are the Trojans suffering in a foreign land, the Hurons are their loyal allies in that foreign land, just like the Etruscans were to the Trojans. Now, this idea of the French and Hurons as allies is consistent with French colonial policy in the region at the time. Unlike other areas of North America where the Europeans more openly subjugated the indigenous peoples that they encountered, in New France, where the landscape was difficult and the all-important beaver fur trade relied on the labor and expertise of the local indigenous peoples, French colonial policy and rhetoric viewed their indigenous allies as not exactly equal to the Europeans, but at least people that could be negotiated with, worked alongside, and converted to Christianity. All of this still had disastrous results for many of the indigenous tribes, but within the poem, it helps to explain why our poet is looking for classical examples of helpful allies rather than dangerous, quote unquote, savages to describe the Hurons. And excuse me for one more second for a last drink of water. Okay, we finally come to the most important line in terms of what the poet was trying to communicate. And this is line 7, the poet's description of the torture of the Jesuit martyrs by the Iroquois, mangled limbs and bodies burned in fire. The line is built up of references to 2 classical poems, in this case, not the Aeneid. The first is mangled limbs, in Latin, laceros artus. This phrase appears in Ovid's Metamorphoses during his grotesque description of Hercules' death, as Hercules is slowly burnt by a poisoned robe that he had put on. As he tries to tear the robe off, his skin sticks to it and peels away from his body so that it bared his mangled limbs and huge bones. The second reference is to bodies burned in fire, in Latin, ambustaque corpora flammis. This adapts a phrase in Lucan's poem on the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. Here, after Caesar's victory at Pharsalus, Caesar is begged to let the losing side bury their dead. They don't even need to have separate funerals, he's told. He could let the bodies be burned in a single fire, urantur corpora flammis. But Caesar refuses. The point of each of these two references can be found in what happens after the mangling of Hercules' limbs and the denial of funeral pyres to the dead Pompeian soldiers. Hercules suffers horribly as he dies and burns himself on a funeral pyre. But his reward, once his human body has been burned away, is to become a god in heaven. Similarly, the denial of funeral rites to the Pompeians doesn't really matter, because the poet tells us that soon enough there will be a universal pyre that burns the entire world. Lucan is talking about the idea in Stoic philosophy of an apocalyptic end to the universe. Hercules' deification and this Stoic apocalypse are pagan ideas, but they both easily translate to the Christian idea of a martyr rewarded by sainthood and the final apocalypse in which the souls of the faithful will be brought up to heaven. So our poet is using pagan classical material to make a point central to the Christian worldview of the Jesuits. In their zealous mission to win converts to Christianity around the world, they may suffer and even die, but this is okay and even to be desired because the reward for martyrdom is eternal life. I'm going to wrap up now and start by suggesting that this is kind of beautiful in its own way. Our Jesuit poet, who was thinking about the horrible torture and death of several of his Jesuit brothers, as well as the utter failure of a mission to which he had dedicated his life, thinking of this pain, he reaches back to classical models to express it in the beautiful language and ideas that form the basis of his entire culture. Of course, in another way, it's all horrifying. This noble Latin poetry and careful references to the Aeneid tell the story of a fanatical group of Europeans who participated in the colonization and decimation of the indigenous peoples in New France, which initiated a system of exploitation that continues to this day. In fact, it's precisely because the Aeneid was so successful at making the sufferings of the Trojans heroic and making the suffering that they caused when they came to Italy all seem worth it. It's precisely because of the Aeneid's success in justifying what was essentially the forcible colonization of Italy by Aeneas and its people. It's that artistic power that actually makes the Aeneid pretty dangerous sometimes. I started this section on reception by thinking about it in terms of filling gaps in Virgil's poem. One of the most important gaps, I think, is one of perspective. Virgil tells us many stories in the Aeneid, like the suffering and death of Dido, Pallas, and Turnus, all people who met Aeneas and suffered for it. But Virgil doesn't make their stories central to his poem. Their stories are all secondary to the dominant story of Aeneas's divinely ordained mission to found Rome in Italy. This classical model for taking other people's stories and making them subordinate to a dominant colonial narrative is unfortunately one of the reasons that the Aeneid remained central to European culture in the early modern period right up to around World War II. It is an example of classics used to justify bad things. It's not the only way that Virgil's poetry has been used, and there are a lot of good ways that it's been used, which I would be happy to talk about during the question period in a moment. There is, for instance, a fascinating French-Canadian play that adapts the Aeneid as a refugee's story. I saw it a couple years ago, and I think it's absolutely the perfect antidote to the historical use of the Aeneid as a colonial narrative. I do feel a bit bad ending this talk with such a gloomy example of classical reception, but we are in a time when everyone is thinking critically about the stories that we tell and the ways that they can sometimes be harmful. So I thought it might be okay to give you a mix of the fun and serious sides of Latin poetry as I see them. And with that, I'll stop talking and you can tell me what questions you might have or what you would like me to elaborate on. And I thank you for your attention. And I will stop the share.
Well, Kyle, thanks so much. That's a wonderful talk, and of course, it's hard for us as classicists to appreciate exactly what people who don't know Latin understand of what we're talking about. But I thought you did brilliantly, and even without Latin, um, uh, all your color coding and careful explanations made things really as clear as they possibly could be.
Thank you.
Um, the usual tradition is for the moderator to ask a question while other participants have more add questions to the Q&A
Sure.
list. So let me just ask a little bit whether or not we get an indication. These Jesuits, I think, are trained in France and then come to the New World after having received their education there. And so, do we get an indication that their Jesuit education will have included the Aeneid, the Metamorphoses, and the and Lucan? And will they have read other works by those authors, or are they really the greatest hits as understood in that way?
Yeah, so there is this very short poem exists within a broader tradition of Jesuit epic, which is very much in the Virgilian mode, and it's a recent area of study and something I'm still learning about. But there's quite a lot of material out there, including multi-book epics, and one of the really useful things is that we have a quite precise indication of what their curriculum was, because there's written records of them. Off the top of my head, I can't name you all of them, but certainly they would be most of the authors we'd kind of be familiar with in our modern canon. So you would get Virgil, parts of Ovid, Lucan, the Georgics, all of Virgil's works. There were sections of the Aeneid, I think, that were not typically taught. I think they kind of danced around the Dido, at least for the beginners, right? Because there's the idea that kids are not old enough to get this slightly salacious material. So we do know, there's one more, I'm just blanking, Sallust. Sallust is kind of the most important historian, and there is, I think, a reference to Sallust in the last line of the poem that I showed you, when he, how have I translated in English? Destroyed the Algonquins. The Latin word is pessuum dedit, which is quite a rare word in poetry, but there is a very striking passage in Sallust about how one of the problems with civil war is that the victors don't just defeat their enemies, they pessuum dedit, they utterly destroy them. And so I think that's our poet using Sallust to think about the war between the indigenous people as a civil war, on the model of classical civil wars. So all of the references that I've given you are to authors that we know for sure the Jesuits would have included in their education. And then as they once they got out of sort of their basic education, they seem to have had access to pretty much everything that was out there. So some of these epics can get as elusive in as complicated a way as any classical poem. So it's really strikingly sophisticated poetry that is a lot of fun just from a technical perspective to study, and very, very interesting to see them taking those classical pagan models and working with them very carefully, but to tell their Christian story. So
Yeah, wonderful. It's wonderful what they could accomplish without access to Instagram.
oh yeah, exactly. Without databases, with just carrying around their old codices. I'm certainly in awe of these people, although I am cautious not to get carried away with being impressed by their technical know-how, because I'm also conscious that they, not intentionally, that caused a fair amount of harm in this particular case. So it's a very complicated topic for sure.
Certainly. We have a couple questions. One from Sabrina. I'm so glad I noticed that she was able to join us fairly early on in your talk. Sabrina writes, I wanted to come back to a point you made earlier in the lecture regarding the naming of cities and creation of cults around notable men and elite women in the Aeneid. To what extent do we see non-elite women receiving cult in contemporary literature, aside from Caieta?
Yeah, so I mean, that section of the talk was built off of a paper I published a couple years ago that really was specifically, and thank you, very interesting question, really was very specifically focused on the mechanics of the emendation. So it's only recently that I've started to even think about the implications of it. And the short answer is, I don't really know. I think this is the only one of which I'm aware. I do know that the Caieta scene must be modeled in part in a scene on a scene in Naevius, who was an early Roman poet who also wrote about Aeneas's voyage, and there was a woman named Patroclus, I think, who dies and gets an island named after her. So I think there must be an implication of a cult there as well. But we just, as far as I know, we just know her name. We don't really know anything about her. But I mean, Caieta is the only one I know of. The other complication with Virgil, of course, is he's always got one eye on the real world and one eye on the literary world. So he's also working, and I think I promised David I wasn't going to talk about Hellenistic poetry, but here I go. He's also working with some Hellenistic models of hero cults, and the most interesting one is there is a poem by a guy named Callimachus called the Hecale, because it's about a woman named Hecale, who is a poor woman who hospitably receives Theseus when he's on his way for a quest, and then he comes back, finds out that she's died, and gives her a hero cult. So I think part of what Virgil is doing is saying, you know, here's an earlier literary example of a humble woman being given a hero cult. That poem is also very fragmentary, so we don't have all the details. So there's some guesswork in there, but it's partly sort of a literary gesture that he's making, adding some Hellenistic flavor into his epic poem, and the Hellenistic poetry is often very interested in non-traditional literary subjects like humble people or non-elite people, I should say. So that's the best answer I can give for now. As I said, I hope someone will dig into this further, because I think if the implication is that Caieta does get a cult, then that should make us pay a little more attention, because Virgil is giving her even more importance than we realized.
Well, that's wonderful. I think there may be some possibilities for cooperation between you and Sabrina, since Sabrina, a center point of her research is on early Virgin Mary cults throughout the Mediterranean. So there's a tie-in, and just to let you know where that question was coming from.
Yes, let's, Sabrina, it feels weird talking to the void, but Sabrina, let's get in contact. I'll be curious to know more about that.
We also have a question from my colleague Alessandra Caperdoni, who actually just wants to know the title of the French play Reading the Aeneid as a Tale of Refugees.
Yeah, so it is from 2008. The playwright is Olivier Kemeid, K-E-M-E-I-D, who's quite a prominent French-Canadian playwright. His family originally emigrated from Egypt, I think in the 1950s. The French title is just L'Aeneid, like the Aeneid, and it's been translated into English as just the Aeneid. So but I think you could track it down by looking for Olivier, Kemeid. I saw it at the Stratford Festival here in Ontario, and yeah, it's just absolutely fascinating. It's been published in an English translation. I'm just looking at the book. The book is called Scripting Immigration, New Canadian Plays, and there's the English translation of it there, along with an interview with him. Essentially, his father, I'm using this as an excuse to talk about a play that I now love. Kemeid's father fled Egypt during a war there in the 1950s, I think, came to Canada, and Kemeid, the younger, sees in Aeneas the story of his father, the story, and especially the pain of a refugee having to, by necessity, give up part of his heritage in order to create a future for his children. And this is something that is in the Aeneid, sort of the tension between the Trojanness and the Romanness of Aeneas's people is something that's been discussed. But to see it as a I always teach part of the Aeneid as a tale of refugees, for sure, and it fits very nicely with some existing approaches to the Aeneid. The one really interesting difference is, of course, Aeneas is a refugee, but he's got an awful lot of power. He comes with an army behind him and with a famous name and powerful alliances. And this reimagines him as very much a modern refugee who comes to a new country with nothing. My favorite gesture in the play is in book 6 of the Aeneid. Aeneas goes down to the underworld and sees a procession of all the famous Romans that will eventually be born. And it's a procession of the victors. And our playwright reimagines this as a procession of refugees. And he names just a list of refugees over the past couple hundred years, culminating in the translation with the Syrians, which wasn't in the original version because it happened before the Syrian refugee crisis. So when I saw that, I just thought, he's refocusing on the Aeneid firmly as a tale of the losers, basically, not the victors, and showing how that is that is a really poignant and powerful story. So go track it down. Well worth reading for sure. Quite an interesting response to the Aeneid.
Yeah, wonderful. Alessandra, when she does the introductory mythology course, she often includes Virgil in the Aeneid. For me, Aeneas is too boring a hero, so I go for the Metamorphoses and Ovid. A question from Andreas Augusti. Thank you for a careful and broad-ranging talk. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on the grief-pain dimension in the Aeneid. I understood from your talk that it is particularly connected with the duality of birth and death. What other consequential moments or themes in the Aeneid could ἄχος illuminate?
Okay, I understand. Oh, I'm gonna keep that question so I can see it. I understand your question, except I wasn't thinking of this in terms of the duality of birth and death, so possibly you could elaborate on that if you want. But in the meantime, other consequential moments. So I focused on, and these are all wonderful questions. You're giving me an excuse to talk about the things that I didn't have time to and really wanted to. So I focused on ἄχος as it related to the death of Pallas, and specifically the failure of Aeneas's fides, his treaty with Evander. But that complex of ἄχος and fides also shows up in Aeneas's encounter with Dido in books 1 and 4 of the Aeneid. And here, from Dido's perspective, Aeneas has given a pledge of his faith to her and betrayed it horribly when he leaves, and she kills herself as a result. And Achates shows up in a bunch of scenes leading up to this, and I read that as essentially giving us a premonition of what's going to happen. Dido is entering into this, what she sees as a political alliance, and an alliance of marriage with Aeneas. But what she tragically doesn't realize is that that fides is going to be broken, and it's going to bring her pain. And then the other, I think, very consequential moment is the finale of the Aeneid, when Aeneas has defeated Turnus. Turnus is begging for his life, and Aeneas very nearly relents, very nearly grants Turnus's request to be spared. And the tricky ethical dilemma in this scene is that Aeneas is obligated to kill Turnus as revenge for the death of Pallas. This is something that his fides with Evander obligates him to do. I promised to protect Pallas. I failed. I need to take vengeance. But the other obligation of fides is what a suppliant can lay onto the person he's supplicating. A suppliant also can expect good faith from the person he's supplicating. So Aeneas actually has an insoluble dilemma. If I spare Turnus, I respect his fides, but I don't respect Evander's. If I don't spare him, vice versa. And famously, Aeneas doesn't solve this dilemma rationally. He is reminded of the death of Pallas, flies into a rage and kills Turnus, and then the epic cuts to black. And I think, and there's some complicated reasons that I think the text supports it, I think that this rage that Aeneas feels is ἄχος. I think he specifically feels the exact same kind of ἄχος he had been feeling for Pallas, which is modeled on the Iliad. So in this very final moment of the Aeneid, he one more time gives in to the ἄχος for which he is named, and that makes the ending all the more striking and all the more disturbing, I think. People have always been disturbed by the ending of the Aeneid because it's intensely emotional, right? And I think that emotion is the ἄχος that followed Aeneas, symbolized by Achates, all the way through the epic, and it catches him one last time in the last words of the poem. So yeah, those are the consequential moments. I'm still not grasping the birth and death, but there you have it.
I must admit that I myself wondered a little bit about whether or not when Aphrodite talks about the āchos, she's referring to labor pains.
Okay, I see your birth. Okay, I see the birth now. I forgot about that. I don't know, and I think probably a Hellenist will be able to speak more authoritatively to that. I mean, goddesses in particular never actually feel very happy when they've slept with a mortal man, like Peleus and Thetis, for instance. So I had taken that as just sort of a mental anguish, but and Áχos in Homer doesn't typically mean physical pain. Actually, it never means physical pain. It's a mental. It is specifically a mental grief or a mental anger that very often leads to the desire for some sort of vengeance or something. So unless it can be used differently in the Homeric hymns, I think that Áχos is most accurately described or translated as mental pain of some sort.
Yeah. LSJ certainly have no text that gives any support for labor pain.
Okay, good.
So there you go. But I guess there is a kind of congenital reason for him to have Áχos in that Turnus situation. But most of us, I think that Virgil sticks it in there because he wants to draw a parallel between Aeneas and Achilles and Odysseus and their book 22 killings of Hector and the suitors.
Yeah, for sure. And Casali's article that I'm building off of also draws the connection to Odysseus as another man of pain. One of the etymologies for his name also comes from pain. Reading the ending of the Aeneid through the Iliad, which has of course been done a million times, is really productive. Reading it specifically through Achilles' ἄχος, I think, is especially productive, because one of the striking things about not book 22 of the Iliad, but book 24, is that when Achilles reconciles with Priam and grants that suppliant's request to give his son's body back, twice, I think, Achilles says something along the lines of, let us grieve together, let us put aside our shared Áχος for now and sort of be humans together. And so it is in part Achilles' recognition that both he and Priam experience Áχos, that shared recognition of an emotion, leads to reconciliation in the Iliad. In the Aeneid, it leads to one last moment of violence. So I think that's Virgil taking what I read as a pretty horrific turn on the Iliad.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. I wondered about going back a little bit to the Ovid passage that you started with or made reference to at the beginning of your talk, that got you to sacris, I guess.
Yes.
And well, I guess the pretender as a textual critic in me was excited by the possibility of finding some other combination of words that, could it be ex rete? Well, if only it were a second declension word, but
yeah, to make the correspondence a little bit more exact, right?
That's it, yeah.
So interestingly, in the Middle Ages, they start, rete, the adverb, did originate as, I'm pretty sure, as an ablative of a noun, which does not exist in the classical period. By the Middle Ages, they were starting to use res, ritus as a noun again. So it kind of comes full circle. The reason I didn't include, which I didn't include in the talk for interest of time, the reason why I'm reasonably confident that it's sacris emrite salutis is another poet writing a little after Ovid named, well, we don't think of it as a poet usually, Columella, but he does have a section of his book on agriculture in book 10 of that work, written in hexameters, and it sort of adds a fifth book to Virgil's Georgics, which is a poem on agriculture. And so lots of references to Virgil because he's writing in the Virgilian style. And towards the end of that book, we find the precise half line, sacris iam rite solutis. So Ovid makes me pretty confident that Aeneas and sacris have to kind of go together. Columella is one of the reasons I'm reasonably confident that the word that's missing after sacris is iam, because Columella, I think, read sacris emrite salutis in Virgil and just copied it exactly. But I will say the iam is the part I'm least confident in it. And that's one of the interesting things about emendation is you can, or about textual criticism in general, you can have the same solution to a problem, you can have part of it that you're, I would say, almost 100% sure on, which is the sacris, and then part of it that is more speculative. So it's an ongoing process, and maybe someday someone will find further evidence that, pushes the needle one way or the other.
Well, with that, I think it's time for us to let you go. It's been wonderful meeting you, and I hope that we can have you on campus sometime in the not too distant future. And I wish you all best for the end of term and the long weekend that we get now in front of us.
Yes.
If you had been out here, perhaps you would have lingered and spent some more time seeing Vancouver, but we'll make that happen another year.
Certainly. I was very sad to miss that opportunity, so we'll do it in the future. But thank you, everyone, for your attention. It was a pleasure to meet you electronically, and those were some excellent questions. And I'm going to go and have dinner now.
Yeah, sure. Bye for now.
Bye for now.